I said stop. You are not leaving this place. Do exactly as I told you.
Beat her. Cunnell's voice ripped through the humid, lecky night, like a gunshot. Beat her until she stops breathing. The compound walls echoed with it. Before I could step back, Odessa's fist crashed into my jaw. My ears rang. My vision flashed white. Pain exploded behind my eyes like something had been detonated deep inside my skull. I stumbled. My knees buckled. The thick Lagos night air felt suffocating as my body tried to understand what was actually happening to it. Tola grabbed my braids and yanked me hard to the interlocked tiles. The impact was fast and total. Teacher respect. Cunnell barked again. Respect. That was the word my husband used while his sisters kicked my ribs. The first kick knocked the air out of me completely. My lungs collapsed inward like crushed paper. I tried to gasp. Nothing came. Just a terrible silence where breath should have been. The second kick cracked something deep in my chest. I heard it before I felt it. A low, dull sound that traveled from my ribs straight into my spine and sat there. The third made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. Every inhale was a punishment. Every exhale was a prayer I was not sure would be answered. And through the blur of pain and humiliation, I saw him, arms folded, face expressionless, watching me choke on the driveway of the house I purchased with my own money. There were no tears in his eyes, no conflict, no hesitation, not a single flicker of the man I had married, just cold, calculated indifference, as if watching his wife beaten by his own sisters on their shared property was the most reasonable response to a simple financial question, because that is all I had done. I asked one question. I built a logistics company from scratch on Victoria Island. I started with one truck, one driver, and a rented desk inside a shared office in Surulere. I scaled to 15 trucks, 42 staff, and 3 active government contracts across 6 years of sleepless nights, brutal negotiations, pre-dawn market runs, and a level of grit that most people never survive long enough to develop. Every naira that company generated came from discipline, not luck. For days earlier, I had asked one simple question. Why did 8 million Nigerian nairas leave our joint account without my consent? That was it. Cunnell said it was family support. He said it casually, comfortably, the way a man answers a question he has quietly rehearsed because he expected it eventually. He looked me in the eye and explained that his sisters needed help covering some expenses, as if 8 million Nigerian nairas was a small gesture, as if my money existed as a communal resource he had inherited silent rights over simply by virtue of proximity. I called it financial disrespect. He called his sisters. And now I was bleeding on our driveway, with gravel pressing into my cheek and my wrist bent wrong beneath me, wondering whether the man standing 10 feet away had ever actually been the man I believed I married. Tola twisted my braids harder. Adila's heel connected with my lower back. I bit down on a scream because I refused, absolutely refused, to give them the satisfaction of hearing it. The security man from a neighboring compound eventually shouted from beyond the fence. His voice cut through the compound like a lifeline. The sisters stepped back, not from shame. They felt none. They stepped back because a witness had appeared, and witnesses change the atmosphere even when they change nothing else. Cunnell walked inside without looking back. Not a glance. Not a word. He walked away as if the scene behind him was already filed and forgotten. I lay on those interlocked tiles for what felt like a very long time. The night insects were loud. The air smelled like moist earth and street exhaust, and something metallic from the back of my throat. My ribs screamed. My wrist throbbed in a way that told me something had landed wrong. That was the night my marriage ended. Not when I first discovered the missing 8 million Nigerian nairas. Not when he refused to give me a real explanation. Not even the first time he raised his voice at me, years earlier, and I quietly excused it as stress and moved on. It ended there. On those tiles, in that silence, while he walked away. They thought they were breaking me, but they were igniting something far more dangerous. Because pain can destroy you, or it can activate you. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone in panic. I didn't beg. I lay there on the ground, counted my breaths through the burning in my ribs, and I made a decision that would alter every single thing that came next. I thought about every contract I had negotiated alone, every sleepless night I had spent building a company while he slept beside me, unbothered, every time I had deposited earnings into a joint account and told myself this was what partnership looked like. I thought about the way I had stretched my trust further than it deserved to go again and again, because I believed that effort and loyalty and love would eventually be enough to make a man into the version of himself I had decided he could become. They are not enough. Nothing is enough for a person who has already decided what you are for. I understood that completely. There on those tiles, with the night insects loud in the trees above me. And then I understood something else. Everything he had benefited from, every structure, every property, every financial advantage he had moved quietly through, I had built, which meant it could be dismantled, or reclaimed, or redirected entirely. That was the thought that lifted me off the ground. That night, I activated. If the person you love most ordered your beating to silence you over a financial question you had every right to ask, would you forgive them, disappear quietly, or make absolutely sure they understood what they chose to start? Drop your answer below. Subscribe, because what happens in the next part will show you exactly how a woman who has been broken becomes a woman who cannot be reached. Greenview Hospital. Ikoyi, 3 cracked ribs, fractured wrist, severe internal bruising. The doctor said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a woman who had spent 6 years building a life, only to discover that everything she believed she was building had been slowly hollowed out from underneath her. I felt like someone who had unknowingly financed the architecture of her own betrayal. I felt stupid, and then I felt cold. And cold, I would learn, is far more useful than stupid. Cunnell didn't visit, not on day 1 when I was admitted, and the nurses processed my injuries under intake lighting. Not when they asked quietly if there was someone they should contact. Not even when the hospital sent an automated emergency notification to the number on my file, which was his. Instead, he sent one message at 11:47 p.m. on day 2. When you're ready to apologize, come home. Apologize for questioning the disappearance of my own money. I read that message 3 times. The first time I felt rage so immediate it was almost physical. The second time I felt grief, deep, heavy, the kind that arrives when you finally let yourself understand what something actually was. The third time, something inside me went very, very quiet. Not the quiet of defeat. The quiet of a decision forming at a level below emotion. The quiet that settles in when a woman is finally, completely done. My best friend Amaka arrived on day 2. She walked in carrying plantain chips and puff puff in the roadside cellar near her office because she knew hospital food would insult me. She sat beside my bed, looked at the bandaging on my wrist, looked at the bruising along my jaw and cheekbone, and said nothing for a full minute. She just sat there and looked. Then, "He allowed it?" she asked quietly. "Yes." Her jaw tightened. "Then this isn't marriage. It's control." That word hit differently. Control. I held that word for the rest of day 2, and I replayed 6 years through it. The way he'd begun handling my business contacts as if they were mutual property. The way he had slowly inserted himself into financial decisions I had originally made alone. The way he positioned his family's needs as obligations I quietly owed without negotiation, without discussion, without even the dignity of being asked. The way every boundary I set was worn down, one compromise at a time, until I had stopped noticing I had given it up entirely. This did not begin with the 8 million Nigerian nairas. This had begun much earlier, in smaller rooms, in quieter moments I had chosen not to name. By day 3, I discharged myself against medical advice. The doctor expressed his concerns clearly. I listened, nodded, signed everything required, thanked the nursing staff, and walked out with my ribs wrapped tight and my wrists in a cast. I did not go home. I went directly to my office in Victoria Island, took the elevator alone, walked down the corridor with the low hum of the air conditioning and the sound of my own footsteps, sat behind my desk, the desk I bought with the profits from my first company contract, and opened my phone. First call, Barrister Chike Okafor, my corporate lawyer for 4 years. A precise, quiet man who did not perform sympathy and did not waste time on things that could not be changed. A man who protected me from 2 predatory contracts and 1 attempted fraud, and who understood, without being told, when a conversation was moving into a different category. Chaik, the duplex in Ikorodu that I financed last year, the one Kunnel's sisters are living in. Who holds legal title? I heard him typing. A long pause. Title is registered under Adil Adiemi, but the source funds trace entirely to you. Every transfer, every tranche. I have the documentation from the original filing. Meaning that with the right filing and a willing judge, you can pursue beneficial ownership. The legal argument is that the title was always held in proxy. It was never a gift in any formal sense, and it was never meant to be permanent. The paper trail supports you completely. How fast can this move? 3 days if we begin today. Begin! Second call, my accountant, Mr. Emmanuel. How much liquidity can I access without touching payroll or active contracts? Enough to move aggressively. Your Q3 reserves are completely intact. Good. I need a full asset separation brief. Everything in my name alone. Everything held jointly. And everything I finance that is currently titled under any other name. A pause on his end. Then, I'll have it ready by morning. Because here is what Kunnel did not know, what none of them understood. The duplex in Ikorodu that his sisters had occupied and decorated and quietly started treating as their inheritance? I had paid for every single kobo of it. I had structured it as an investment vehicle on the advice of my accountant. Not as a gift, not as a marital gesture, and certainly not as something I ever intended to become permanent. The paper trail was clean. The documentation was perfect. By day 4, everything was in motion, and that is when Kunnel finally called. "You've embarrassed me enough," he said, as if the conversation we were having had anything to do with his reputation. "No," I replied. "You embarrass yourself." He scoffed. "You'll come back. You always come back." I smiled. I don't know if he could hear it, but I felt it. "No, Kunnel, I'm not coming back. I'm coming forward." When someone finally shows you their full unmasked character, not who they pretended to be, but exactly who they are, do you spend your energy arguing with what you've seen, or do you go quiet and begin repositioning everything in your favor? Tell me what you would do. Subscribe, because what happens next involves showing up at their door with something they never anticipated. Saturday, 4 p.m., Ikorodu. I wore a white linen shirt and flat sandals. No performance in my appearance. No theatrics in my face. Just calm. The deep, unhurried calm of a woman who has already made a decision and is simply arriving at the moment it takes effect. The house I built stood tall and quiet in the thick afternoon heat. The shrubs along the fence had been freshly trimmed. The gate had been repainted in a color Adeola had chosen without consulting me. There were new curtains in the upstairs window that I did not recognize, a certain blue that wouldn't have been my selection. They had settled. They had grown comfortable. They had occupied my investment as if time and familiarity were the same thing as legal ownership. They were inside laughing when we arrived. Me, Barrister Chaik, 2 court officials, 1 police officer. We had made the drive from Victoria Island in 2 vehicles. The officer was present for lawful order only, not for force, not for drama. Chaik had advised me to bring one because documents with legal teeth are better received when the room understands that the institution behind them is also present. It was not a statement. It was just good strategy. Adesawa opened the gate first. She was still laughing at something, still looking back over her shoulder at whoever was inside the house when the gate swung open. Then she turned, and her face froze completely. "What are you doing here?" "Business," I said calmly. She looked at the police officer, then at Chaik's briefcase, then back at my face. She shouted for Kunnel. He appeared in the doorway a few seconds later. Shirt half-buttoned, slippers, the easy expression of a man comfortable in someone else's property. That expression began to fade the moment he registered what he was actually looking at. "What is this nonsense?" he said, but the authority had already left his voice. Barrister Chaik stepped forward with the measured, unhurried precision of a man who has been to enough of these moments to find no pleasure in them beyond the clean, quiet execution of the law. We are here to formally deliver property reclamation documents for the premises at this address, registered under the name of Adeola Adeyemi and financed entirely by Mrs. Zara Oganyemi. Silence. The particular kind of silence that falls when people realize that the story they've been telling themselves has just been interrupted by a set of facts they cannot argue away. Adeola stepped forward and grabbed the document. Her eyes moved across it quickly, scanning, searching for a technicality, an error, an exit, and finding none. This is rubbish. No, I said, it's ownership. Cunnell's face drained of color. Not with anger. That came later. What came first was recognition. He understood finances. He had spent years positioned beside me close enough to understand exactly what a paper trail looked like when it was complete and clean and legally airtight. You wouldn't dare, he said. I already did. Chike continued, laying out the facts with the measured, level tone of a man delivering information. Not arguing, not performing, just stating what is true. The financial records established that all construction costs, land acquisition, and utility development for this property trace entirely to Mrs. Zara Oganyemi. Under applicable Nigerian property law, beneficial ownership may override proxy title where clear financial provenance exists. The court has agreed to review the claim on an expedited basis. This document triggers that process formally. Odessa screamed. It was a raw, disbelieving sound, the sound of a person confronting a reality that has no place for them in it. This is our home. It was mine, I said quietly. You were guests. You simply forgot that at some point. Cunnell moved closer to me. Too close. The police officer shifted his weight slightly, but held position. He was watching. You are destroying this marriage, Cunnell said through his teeth. You destroyed it. I replied, the night you stood in this compound with your arms folded and watched your sisters beat me on our driveway. I was simply too busy bleeding to respond at the time. He had nothing. That was the most complete moment. Not the delivery of the documents. Not Adeola beginning to cry. Not the presence of the officer making it clear that physical resistance was not an option. The most complete moment was the silence after my words, and the way Cunnell looked at me like he was encountering a version of me for which he had made no preparation. He had prepared for a wife who would beg, who would call, and plead, and eventually return. He had not prepared for a woman who had spent 4 days building a legal case. How long do they have? I asked Chike. 24 hours to vacate under the interim order. The injunction is already registered with the court. I reached into my bag and handed Cunnell a second envelope, smaller than the first, cream-colored, his name in black ink across the front. Divorce papers. He looked at the envelope, then at me. His hands trembled, not from grief. I thought, from the very particular sensation of realizing that the power you believed you held over a situation has been completely, quietly, irreversibly transferred to someone else. You'll regret this, he said. No, I said. You will. I turned and walked back to the car. My pace was even. My breathing was steady. I felt no urge to run, no desire to look back, no need to check whether my words had landed. I didn't look back. Not once. Tell me the truth. Did I go too far here, or did I not go nearly far enough? Because what came after this moment extended beyond that property entirely. Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe, because what collapses next is not just a house. It is an entire structure. The next afternoon, the locksmith changed the locks. I had arranged everything with military precision. Chike held the injunction. The interim court order provided legal possession pending the full hearing, which meant the lock change was entirely clean, documented, authorized, and beyond dispute. The locksmith arrived at exactly 2 p.m. He was professional, efficient, and done within 45 minutes. Neighbors whispered. People on the street slowed their walking. A small crowd gathered the way people in Lagos naturally do when something significant is unfolding. Not from cruelty, but from the deeply communal understanding that certain moments deserve to be witnessed. Cunnell stood outside with suitcases, 2 large ones, a carry-on, his laptop bag over one shoulder. The assembled possessions of a man who had quietly convinced himself that proximity to wealth was the same thing as ownership of it. now standing on the street outside a house that no longer received him. For the first time, he looked powerless, not angry, not calculating, not the man who had folded his arms in the compound 4 nights earlier while his sisters kicked my ribs. Just powerless. And somehow that was more complete, more accurate than anger would have been. But I wasn't done. This is what I need you to understand about the difference between emotional retaliation and strategic consequence. Emotional retaliation has a ceiling. It releases pressure in the moment, but it does not alter structures. It does not change what is legally yours. It does not move anything permanently. Real structural change requires you to think about resources, leverage, documentation, and time. It requires patience. It requires you to build quietly and continue building while the people who hurt you assume you are still occupied with hurting. I had been building quietly for far longer than 4 days. 3 months before the 8 million Nigerian nairas disappeared. Before any of this broke open into its final form, I had made a business decision. Through a holding company I had registered separately from my main logistics firm, I quietly acquired the commercial property on Lagos Island, where Colonel's auto parts distribution company had been operating for years. It was a sound acquisition on its own merits. Excellent location, strong yield, the kind of asset that belongs in a properly structured portfolio. The fact that my husband's business happened to operate from that address was, at the time, merely incidental. It became relevant the morning his lease renewal notice arrived at the address of a new landlord, which was mine. His property manager called the holding company's registered line. A representative fielded the inquiry. The message was forwarded to me. I made the call personally. Colonel answered on the second ring. I could hear from the background noise that he was still on the street, managing suitcases, taking calls from his sisters, trying to locate somewhere he could go. His voice changed the instant he recognized my number. He started talking before I could get a word in. Something about lawyers overreaching, something about this being too far, something about being a husband and being owed a degree of protection from his own wife. I let him finish, completely, without interrupting. Then I said, "Your lease for the Lagos Island property is due for renewal. You'll be receiving formal correspondence from a new landlord's office." A pause. New landlord. Yes. Another pause. Longer. I could almost hear the calculation happening. You bought the building. It was not a question. Yes. You're ending my business. No, I said, I am ending your control. Your business can relocate. Businesses find new premises. What ends today is the assumption that your position in my marriage, in my finances, or anywhere adjacent to my life insulates you from the natural consequences of what you chose to do. He went silent. A genuine silence. Not tactical. The kind that settles when a man has run completely out of moves and is simply sitting in that fact. His sisters had begun calling him in waves of panic. Adeola had received a full vacate notice that morning and had made calls in every direction. Family elders, a pastor, a lawyer acquaintance who had apparently confirmed the situation was not easily reversed. Colonel's mother called me directly, voice breaking, asking if we couldn't settle this inside the family. I listened to her fully. I gave her the space to say everything she needed to say. She was a woman who loved her son and did not fully understand the shape of what he'd become. "Mama," I said finally, "I loved your son for 6 years. I built a home for his family with my own money. I asked one question about my own account, and I ended up in a hospital with 3 cracked ribs and a fractured wrist. This is not something that can be settled by elders. This is something that has already been decided." She wept. I understood her grief. I held space for it. But holding space for someone's pain does not mean absorbing the consequences of the cruelty that produced yours. When Adeola stood outside the Icorda property that evening as the furniture inventory was being completed, she looked at me with hollow, disbelieving fury, the expression of someone who had never once considered that the comfort they occupied had conditions. "Where will we go?" she demanded. I looked at her steadily. "You made that decision the night you chose violence. This was not rage. This was consequence. Strategic, legal, silent, and absolute. If someone spent real, deliberate effort trying to break your spirit and strip everything you had built, would you come apart? Would you rebuild in secret? Or would you construct something so strategically exact that by the time they understood what happened, it was already irreversible? Tell me what you would do. Subscribe, because the final part of the story is not about destruction. It is about what a woman builds when no one is watching. 3 weeks after that Saturday afternoon, in Ikorodu, the divorce was finalized. No alimony, no settlement, no extended courtroom theater. Because when you are built correctly, when the right names are on the right documents and the paper trail is clean and your legal representation knows exactly what it is handling, there is very little left to contest. Everything that mattered had always been in my name. The things that were not were returned to me through the proceedings. It was, ultimately, a clean severance. I drove home from the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon, not to the Lekki property. I had vacated it 2 weeks earlier and moved into a service apartment in Onairu while I finalized my next arrangement. I drove home, changed into a loose kaftan that had been in my wardrobe since before all of this began, made a pot of Lipton with too much sugar, and sat on a balcony watching the movement of Lagos below me. I expected to feel more. 6 years. A marriage I had genuinely believed in. A man I had respected enough to construct something alongside. I expected grief to arrive like a flood. Instead, it came the way the end of a very long shift comes. A quiet, particular exhaustion, and then a kind of peace that felt almost unfamiliar, like a room you haven't entered in years that still smells exactly as you remember it. I let myself feel it without interrogating it. Therapy helped. I began sessions with Dr. Funk, whose practice was in Lekki Phase 1. She was a small, measured woman who listened without interrupting and asked questions that stayed with me for days after each appointment. She helped me understand that what had happened was not a failure of my judgment or my instincts. I had sensed the shifts, I had responded to them, and eventually I had acted decisively. What took work to understand was how I had trained myself, over many years, to minimize the evidence I was already holding, how I had made myself progressively smaller in the spaces he occupied, how I had mistaken devotion for the permanent suspension of self-awareness. That was the more demanding work, not the legal filings or the property proceedings. The more demanding work was sitting in a quiet office on a Thursday morning and trying to understand clearly how a woman who was capable, strategic, and financially independent had allowed the boundary lines of her own life to be systematically redrawn by someone who had decided, long before the 8 million Nigerian nairas, long before the compound, long before any of the visible events, that her role was to provide resources, not to be protected by the person beside her. Healing helped more than anything else could have. By the 3rd month after the divorce, my logistics company had signed 2 significant new government contracts. One in Abuja, covering supply chain management for a federal infrastructure development program. One in Port Harcourt, supporting the petroleum sector. Revenue doubled. My team expanded by 12 staff. I brought in a new operations director who had previously worked for a major firm in Dubai and who understood exactly what kind of growth the company was positioned for. I started sleeping properly for the first time in years, without the ambient tension of sharing a home with someone whose motives I could no longer trust. I also bought a house, not the Lekki property. I had no desire to remain in a space that held those rooms and that driveway, a new one, in a quieter neighborhood, with a garden that caught the morning light, and a kitchen I designed exactly the way I had always imagined it, and walls that held only my own taste. It felt like breathing for the first time in years. There were moments of doubt. I will not pretend otherwise. Some evenings, driving back from a long meeting with the city, moving past the windows, a particular song would come on, and I would feel something dense and slow move through me. Not regret for what I had done. Grief, still, for the version of life I had once believed was possible. The version in which the man standing in that compound had been who I thought he was. The version in which none of this was necessary. I let myself grieve that version, and then I let it go. 6 months after the finalization, Kano sent a text. A single line, "We made a mistake." I read it standing in my new kitchen, still wearing the suit I had worn to a board meeting that morning. I read it once completely, then I deleted it, not from anger, not as a performance. Because some messages have no response that improves on silence. And some chapters genuinely do not deserve a sequel. Because love without respect is not love. It is management presented as affection. And respect without reciprocity is not partnership. It is service performed without a contract. They thought breaking my body would break my spirit. Instead, they trigger my evolution. I am Zaro Ganyemi. I am the woman who began with one truck in Surulere and built a multi-city operation. The woman who financed a duplex and reclaimed it with documentation and composure. The woman who sat in a hospital bed with cracked ribs and a fractured wrist and called her lawyer before she called anyone else. The woman who ended a marriage on her own terms, with her name on every document that mattered and her company still growing. I don't retaliate emotionally. I respond strategically. And sometimes silence is not weakness. Silence is preparation. The women who come for you with noise and chaos and violence are announcing their next move before they make it. The woman who goes quiet, she is already 3 steps ahead. And when she moves, you will not see it coming. Not until it is already done. Let me ask you this. Was what Zara did revenge, or was it justice? And if you had been in her position, the assets, the paper trail, every receipt in order, would you have gone further, or is exactly this where it should have stopped? Leave your honest answer below. And if powerful Nigerian stories built on strategy, betrayal, and the kind of comeback that cannot be undone are why you're here, you already know what to do. Subscribe. There is more coming.